So how might we measure the relative economic performance of different economic systems and different economies? By far and away the most common way is through GDP, which you've probably heard about. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. Although the idea of GDP goes back all the way to the mid-17th century, its modern rendition was only introduced in 1934 by a famous economist called Simon Kuznets. So the idea of measuring economies in this way is actually fairly new. How does GDP work? Well, GDP is the summation of all the goods and services produced in an economy for final consumption over a year. And there's several advantages of using GDP. Perhaps the most important one is that it's relatively easy to measure. Of course, there's still problems, like accounting for inflation, which is a fancy word for the general increase in prices. And also, how do you compare different economies that produce completely different things? But these disadvantages notwithstanding, GDP is by far the most popular measure of economic performance. There's several problems, however. GDP is a flow measure. Are you okay? You're looking, yeah, right. There's several problems, however. GDP is a flow measure, like a cash flow measure. It measures the flow of new stuff produced in an economy over a particular period of time. It's not a stock measure. If you were to compare it to a balance sheet item for a business, say, it's quite close to annual revenue. Now, of course, if you're running a business, or if you're a shareholder in one, you'd be very interested to see what the annual revenue was. But would it be the only thing you would focus on to judge whether this company was doing well or not? The answer is, of course not. Imagine that you're running an electric car company. You make electric cars for a living. All the annual revenue would tell you was how many cars you sold in a given year. Your factory might get hit by lightning, completely destroying the stock of electric cars you were planning to sell next year and all the machinery in it, and this would not be reflected in the annual revenue, just like it wouldn't be reflected in a country that suffered massive natural disasters when it comes to GDP. From a sustainability point of view, there's perhaps even more serious problems, however. GDP doesn't measure the stock of natural capital. That's things like forests, ecosystem services, like the ability of our oceans and forests to stabilize the climate and to produce the food and other things that we need. GDP doesn't take account of depreciation or indeed improvement in natural capital. So if you went on a huge forestry spree, planting trees and providing habitat for animals all over the country, this also wouldn't be reflected in GDP. There are several alternatives. Now, when it comes to natural capital in particular, there's something called green GDP, which tries to adjust the idea of GDP with depreciation or improvement in the natural capital of the country. That's just one alternative. There are many others. You might have heard in Bhutan, they use something called a gross happiness index. They're actually looking beyond just monetary value at the actual level of happiness of the local population. A similar sort of indicator is used in the American state of Vermont, called the Genuine Progress Indicator. There's many more. You might have heard of the Human Development Index. This is an example of sort of a hybrid index. It doesn't just look at economic measures, but also looks at things like crime, mortality rates, infant birth rates, and so on and so on. There's problems with this alternative class of indexes, though. They often have to be weighted. And how do you decide how different factors are going to be weighted? And then there's the perhaps even stickier problem. How do you put a monetary value on nature? How do you put an actual value expressed in monetary terms on natural capital? And this brings us back to the question of the capitalist system and alternatives. Now, arguably, attempts at putting a value on natural capital so far haven't always been in nature's best interest. A big part of the explanation for why that has happened is because markets work best if you've got sellers and buyers interacting together to settle a price. But when it comes to the value of rhinos or of rainforests, you can't expect rainforests or rhinos to negotiate on what their value is. So often other agents, humans, have to play the role in representing natural capital. And that's where things get sort of messy. There's another critique that you increasingly hear, which is that placing a value on nature is the first path on a dangerous road towards commodification, marketization, and ultimately financialization, where arguably small vested interest groups, financial institutions and so on, have an increasingly important role to play in benefiting from the process of establishing a price on natural capital in the first place, and perhaps sometimes at the cost of the original objective in the first place, which was maintaining and managing nature appropriately.